The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Alice Ann Bailey, Director of Goal Alliance at SREB, and I want to welcome you to afternoon's event. And I'm going to give everyone just a few more minutes. We've got a lot of attendees who are just jumping on. I'm going to give them a few minutes to join us real quick. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alice Ann Bailey. I direct the Go Alliance here at SREB. We are so thrilled you could join us for this very special webinar today that really came out of some conversations that I had with school counseling, with school counselors at the School Counseling Conference held by ASCA, the American School Counseling Association, this past summer, in which school counselors told me that they didn't really fully understand the benefits that come from attending a minority serving institution, and really what they were and their purpose. So the first webinar that we had provided an overview of minority serving institutions and the history of why they were founded and their focus and goals. If you missed that, I encourage you to look on the SREB website, and a recording with the PowerPoints are posted there. If this is your first webinar that you've attended with Go Alliance, let me tell you very quickly a little about what we do. We sit at SREB, which is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research think tank organization, and this program specifically focuses on helping students who would be the first in their family to plan, apply, and successfully complete a post-secondary credential after high school. So a lot of our work focuses on doing focus group research and better understanding the needs and perspectives of this target audience and how we can take that information to best help them in creating things like support programs and informational tools to help them. We also work with our policymakers at the state level, so state legislatures, and we collect a lot of data and inform them so that they can make informed policy decisions. We try to work at the state level with a network of college access organizations. This might include the Higher Education Agency, the Department of Education, the K-12 agency, nonprofit organizations that focus on college access and success for students, foundations, school counseling associations, local businesses, and others, in order to all come together and see how we can work together towards the single goal of supporting more students to help them get into and through higher education. And then the last bullet point, we also produce a lot of materials to help inform students and their families so that they can better understand the process and what's required on their end. So I'd like to go ahead and start introducing our speakers for today. And these are Robert Nathanson and Mary Beth Gassman. Robert Nathanson is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research. He has experience in experimental and quasi-experimental design, as well as rigorous econometric, I didn't say that right, and behavioral science techniques to apply policy questions in post-secondary education, K-12 education, and the health fields. His research focuses on questions of access, persistence, affordability, student loan debt, and mobility for minority and low-income student populations. So a lot of overlap there in our work. Mary Beth Gassman is the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Endowed Chair of Education and is Distinguished Professor at Rutgers University. She also serves as the Executive Director of the Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice at Rutgers, as well as the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. Prior to joining Rutgers, she served as the director of the Penn Center for Minority Serving Institutions, and she's one of the leading authorities in the country on HBCUs and MSIs. Today, we're going to focus specifically on some work that they have undertaken for working for the impact of HBCUs. So I'm going to go ahead and call up their slides and turn it over to our presenters. Let's see. All right, Mary Beth and Robert, are you with us?
We are.
Here.
Just let me know when you get the slides up.
Can you see them?
I cannot.
Okay.
No.
So let's.
I can see a slide, the contact slide.
Yeah, but that's not what we want to see, so I'm glad I asked. How about now?
Yes, they need to, from the beginning, yes. Can you go to the first slide? All right, great. I think we're good. Oh, you can go back, sorry, to the title. Okay, so welcome everyone. We're really excited to talk to you today. And we'll be talking for a little bit and then we'll open it up for questions. I wanted to give you just a little bit of background. Robert and I started working on this project a couple years ago, and we have a great partnership. My background doing work related to HBCUs and his really immense quantitative skills. And so he came to me to talk about how we could take a look at HBCUs in terms of this data related to income mobility, and I was really excited. And I want to tell you why I was excited. The main reason is that for any of you who know anything about HBCUs, what you know is that a lot of times they are maligned in the national media and by many different individuals and organizations, and which it's an unfair maligning. And so one of the things that I'm excited about in terms of this research is that we have empirical data that helps us to understand the unique contributions of Black colleges, and so we can make some really important statements about the contributions and the work that they're doing. And the data that we're using is a quantitative data that Robert's going to talk to, and then the comments that I'm going to make are based on years of doing historical and qualitative research with thousands of individuals, and so we feel really good about the what we're going to be able to share with you today. So I'm going to start off by giving you a little bit of context. You can go to the next slide, and then we'll move into kind of the meat of this. And this is all in a report that we can have SREB send out to you afterward as well. And then we'll end with sort of some lessons overall for all types of colleges and universities. So to start off, I just want to give you a little bit of the by the numbers with regard to HBCUs for those of you who don't know that much about them. There are 102 accredited HBCUs. You know, they're roughly split public and private, and then there are a few non-accredited HBCUs, and so that's just to kind of give you a feel for the landscape overall. And right now they enroll 8% of Black students. And that's roughly 290,000 students across the country. I think that it's important to understand that they disproportionately graduate African American students, so they graduate 14%, even though they only enroll 8%. And of course, Robert's going to kind of get us into the nitty-gritty of some other important contributions that they make. The overall graduation rate at HBCUs is 35%. That's compared to the graduation rate of Black students overall in the country, which would be 41%. And then if you look at the graduation rate for students throughout the nation, it's roughly 60%. So one thing that I always like to point out in these graduation rates is to keep in mind that the majority of HBCU students, it's nearly, large numbers, over 70% are Pell Grant eligible students, which are students that are going to be in the kind of lowest financial quartile. And so what we know from decades and decades of research is it's harder to graduate students from low-income backgrounds. I was one of those students, and if it weren't for some amazing mentors, I would have had a very difficult time getting out of college. So Black colleges are going to have a whole variety of types of students, but overwhelmingly they are going to have low-income students. And as you can see, the percentage of students on Pell Grants hovers around 71%. And the last thing that I think is a really important number for people to keep in mind is the incredible diversity in terms of faculty at HBCUs. So they're roughly 60% Black, and that would be Black defined in a broad term, and then 40% non-Black, which would of course include white and Latino and Asian American, Middle Eastern. And so HBCUs have some of the most diverse faculty in the nation. They are much more diverse than predominantly white institutions in terms of their faculty and actually in terms of their student body as well. So you can go to the next slide. So that's a picture of someone that you should all know. That is Kent Wallace, and he is a physicist at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. He runs the Fisk rocket program. And I thought I'd put a picture of him there because he's someone who has always inspired me and is an HBCU faculty member. So I just want to go over quickly some strengths of HBCUs. They are, have a high production of undergraduates in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math. They overproduce given the numbers of students that they have. Which is very substantial, because without HBCUs we would have far fewer African Americans in the STEM fields. They also have a high production, a disproportionate production of graduate and professional students who come from HBCUs and then go into the graduate and professional degrees. So they tend to overproduce, which shows that the experiences that students have tend to lead them to want to secure more education. In this current kind of political climate that we have, they have become known for being a safer learning environment, and there has been a slight uptick in enrollment, and we've done some research here at our center that shows that uptick, that there are some links between that uptick in enrollment and the current climate since 2016. And we have talked with students across 4 different large HBCUs about their reasons for enrolling, and a safe learning environment is one of the things that they talk about. Another aspect of HBCU learning that I think is really fundamental is that there are same race and same gender role models. And one of the things we know from research, I don't know how many of you know Ebony McGee's work at Vanderbilt, but she has shown that same race and same gender role models are really, really important to the learning process, especially of African Americans, but actually to students of color across the board. I think that it's important to point out that the tuition at HBCUs is half the rate of predominantly white institutions, so that people are able to go to school for a lower amount of money. And then the last thing is that I think sometimes it's really obvious, but that we should remember that HBCUs have a stated and demonstrated commitment to African American success, student success. And that's really, really important, because that's not necessarily the mission of colleges and universities in general, but in this particular case it is. So those are some of the kind of numbers and the strengths of HBCUs. I'm going to turn things over to Robert, and he's going to talk a little bit more specifically about the study that we did. All right, Robert.
Thanks so much, Mary Beth. And it's a real pleasure to be here. So thank you for your time. And I wanted to note that if you do have questions, we're going to be saving some time for the end. And so if I can ask that you hold them to the end, we'd be happy to answer them.
And I'm sorry, that's my fault for not letting know, there is a question box that you can type in. So if you have questions as I'm speaking and you want to write them down, go ahead and type them in the question box, and then we will address them at the end.
Thanks, Alice. So in this work, we really wanted to dig into some empirical data about how HBCUs are doing and how they're doing fostering the income mobility of their students. And so we have two research aims, which got listed here on the left side of the slide. And the first is to look at intergenerational income mobility for students who are attending historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs, as compared to their counterparts who are attending predominantly white institutions, or PWIs. And then we also wanted to look, well, within HBCUs, how are they doing across that distribution? And so look at variation across different HBCUs. And the data we used to do this is the Opportunity Insights data that comes out of Raj Chetty and some of his colleagues out of Harvard. And so I wanted to give a little bit of context about the data that we're looking at. And so it comes from two sources. Most of it was compiled by Raj Chetty and his colleagues at Opportunity Insights, and it comes largely from the Internal Revenue Service, where parents' income, which was averaged for when their children were ages 15 to 19, that's the parents' income, and then they were able to link that to children's income in their early to mid 30s. And so we're looking at children that were born in 1980, 1981, 1982, and the parents' income when they were in their mid-teenage years, 15 to 19, and then when they enter their early 30s, so in 2014, so relatively soon, not that many years ago. So we're looking at parental and children's intergenerational income mobility. And the other information comes from the Department of Education, the Integrated Post-Secondary Education Data System, or IPED, and that gives us a little bit of information about the institution. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today, the income mobility from parents to children on different institutions. Thank you. So in this slide, Mary Beth talked about how there are 102 HBCUs. So in our data, we see half of them. We have information in this data on 50 HBCUs, and you can see their distribution. They're in the South, the Southeast, and the Mid-Atlantic states. Some are in Texas, Oklahoma, as far north as Pennsylvania and Maryland. So these are the institutions, the HBCUs we're looking at. And the counterparts of the predominantly white institutions, we have 115 of them. And they are located within the same commuting zone as the HBCUs. Because we know that so many students stay local when they attend post-secondary institutions, we really wanted to compare HBCUs to PWIs in the same geographic area. So for instance, in Atlanta, Georgia Tech and Clark Atlanta University. And so those are the institutions we're looking at. Next slide, please. As Mary Beth alluded to, while we're doing a comparison of HBCUs and PWIs, the institutions can be quite different. And so I've listed a little bit of information which comes from that IPED data source. If we look at the endowment per student, so the average amount of resources an institution has that they can give to their students, they're about $1,500 per student at HBCUs, and it's more than 3 times as high at predominantly white institutions. And so there's a very, very big difference in the resources that these institutions have when we think about they can have for their students. And yet, when it comes to instructional expenditures, there's no statistically significant difference between the institutions, with HBCUs spending about $8,000 on average and PWIs a little bit over $9,000. So a lot of the money is being spent on instructional expenditure. And as Mary Beth said, the cost of attendance is quite different, where it's about half the cost of attendance to attend an HBCU as compared to a PWI. And I want to note that the data that we have is about students that are attending HBCUs as compared to students that are attending predominantly white institutions. Most of the students who attend HBCUs are African American or Black, 86%, but not every student who attends an HBCU is Black. At predominantly white institutions, most of the students are white. About 80%, just a little bit under, are white. About 14% are Black. And so I'm going to be talking about the student experience at HBCUs as compared to predominantly white institutions. It's important to keep in mind that most of the students at HBCUs, but not all, are Black, and most at PWIs, but not all of them are white. Okay. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give you a little sense of the terminology I'll be using throughout the rest of the presentation. When we think about income, we think about an income distribution, and we can split that into fifths or quintiles. And so I'll be using the term quintile quite a bit, where the first quintile is the bottom quintile, the households for when the children were ages 14 to 19 that had incomes in the bottom 20%, 0 to 20th percentile. In the second quintile, I'll be calling lower income. The third quintile, those with incomes between the 40th and the 60th percentile, are what we call the beginning of the middle class. So at least the middle class we consider to be the third quintile or above. Upper middle as the fourth quintile, and the fifth quintile is the top. Those are the most, the households at the highest end of the income distribution, the top 20%, the most affluent. The other terms that I'll be using are in relation to what we're measuring: income mobility, intergenerational, across generations, parents to their children, the income of the parent household as compared to the income of their children. And I'm going to be using two terms, the mobility rate and the success rate. And the mobility rate is the unconditional or joint probability, and the success rate is the conditional probability. And so what I mean by that, for the mobility rate, I mentioned that there are quintiles. So if you think about the 5 quintiles for the parents and the 5 quintiles for the children, you have 25 options. So a child who grew up in a low-income household in the bottom quintile could also end up in the bottom quintile. That's one option. They could start in the top and end up in the top. That's another. So there are 25 of those options, and they sum to 100%. So that's the mobility rate. In contrast, the success rate accounts for their origin. So given that you grew up low income, what percent of those students by institution ended up low income, ended up in the second quintile, the third, the fourth, or the fifth? And so that's the difference between the mobility rate and the success rate, and I'll be talking about those. Okay, next slide, please. We wanted to give you a couple of the key highlights, and then we'll be talking about each of these in more detail. As Mary Beth alluded to, HBCUs enroll far more low-income students than at predominantly white institutions. And we also find that these students experience more upward mobility, which is defined as moving up into an income quintile, which is higher than your parents, and more experience this at HBCUs than predominantly white institutions. And about 70% at HBCUs do so. I'll be talking about that in just a moment. We also see fewer students moving down into a quintile lower than they started at HBCUs than at predominantly white institutions. And we're going to be highlighting a couple of the HBCUs which we think are fostering a particularly good job at improving their student upward trajectory. And then the last slide is about what we call privilege perpetuation, or an affluence floor, and it's about students' ability to kind of maintain the relative status and affluence of their parents. Next slide, please. So on this slide, Alice, there's a little bit that's being cut off on the bottom. I don't know if we're able to fix that. We can see most of it. It's okay.
So I see quintile, and then the last line is total across the bottom. If you cannot see that under the child income quintile table, you might want to maximize your screen for GoToWebinar.
Okay. Okay, thank you. So, so what we have here is I have put in tables in panel A is for HBCUs, panel B is for predominantly white institutions, that unconditional mobility rate. And if you see, each of those tables does sum to 100%. And what I wanted to highlight here is that the student bodies that attend HBCUs and PWIs are very different, where 24, if you look all the way on the right and the top under that total column in the first row, 24% of students who attend HBCUs grew up in households where their parental income was in the bottom 20%, 24%. In the second quintile, that second row, it's 27%. So that means that more than 50% of HBCU students are coming from households which are below what we call at least middle class. And that's not the case at all at the predominantly white institutions. It's, instead of being 1 and 2, it's about 20%, so 1 in 5 students. The opposite is the case at predominantly white institutions, where about 60% grow up in the 4th or 5th quintiles. That's that 26% in the final column, and 33% together at PWIs, and it's only about 28% at HBCUs. So very different student bodies. We're coming from different, very, very different origins. Okay. Next slide, please. So if we take that information which is contained in that previous slide and we add some of those categories together, we're able to then see what the upward trajectory at some of these institutions look like. And so almost 53% of students at HBCUs are upwardly mobile, which means that they moved up at least 1 quintile. And it's about 35% of PWIs, which means there's greater upward mobility, about 50% more upward mobility at HBCUs than PWIs. About 60% at HBCUs move into the middle class, so the 3rd quintile or above, the 3rd, the 4th, or 5th. That means they're moving up, and that's higher than at predominantly white institutions. About 70% end up in the middle class, so that includes people who started there. And so it's about 70% HBCUs, a little bit higher at predominantly white institutions, but far more people start and those higher income quintiles at PWIs and HBCUs. So this, I think, is indicative of HBCUs doing a particularly good job of fostering the upward mobility of the students, especially given the origins of many of these students, the lower income origins of many of these students. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about those conditional mobility measures, or the success rate. And so this is different than what I previously talked about, because instead of the full table, either panel A entirely summing 100%, you can see that the rows summed 100%. So for instance, in panel A for HBCUs, that top row, row 1, column 1, plus 2, plus the 3rd column, the 4th and 5th, each of those rows sums to 100%. And if we, so that's conditioning on the parent's origin. And so if you look at that final column in that first row for HBCUs, 66% of students who started off as low income at HBCUs attain at least what we call a middle class plus status. They have income by their early to mid 30s, which is in at least the 3rd quintile. For those students at HBCUs that were lower income, it's 69%. And it's very similar at predominantly white institutions. So it's about 70% from the low income, and it's about 74% at those who start off as lower income. But there are far fewer students, and HBCUs have far less institutional resources to help foster the students while they're on campus than at HBCUs. So again, this, we think, no matter how we slice it, if we're looking at the unconditional or the conditional mobility, HBCUs are doing a really nice job and comparable to their predominantly white institution counterparts of fostering upward mobility for their students. Next slide, please. The converse of upward mobility is downward mobility. And we see that there's less downward mobility at the HBCUs than their students who are attending the PWI counterparts. At HBCUs, not everybody can move upward. Some people stay the same. They start in the same quintile that and they end up in the same quintile, and some move down. Not everyone can move up. And at HBCUs, about a quarter move down, whereas about 50% more, or 38% at PWIs. And if you look at overall, 30% of students at HBCUs end up in that first or second quintile. That's inclusive of those who started there. And it's about 24% of PWIs. And so if you exclude those who start in those lowest two brackets, if they started in P1 or P2, the parents in the first quintile or the second quintile, only 13% of the students at HBCUs end up in those first or second quintiles. And 18% of predominantly white institutions do. So that means there's less downward mobility and less downward mobility into those income categories, which are lower than what we call middle class at HBCUs than at PWI. Next slide, please. So then we wanted to look. At specific institutions, and so on this figure, the blue dots, the blue diamonds represent predominantly white institutions, and the gold circles are HBCUs. And the x-axis represents, and I'm sorry if it's hard to see, the x-axis represents the percent of the student body whose parents were in the bottom two quintiles, P1 or P2. So they started off in those lowest two categories, and the y-axis represents, if you started off in those bottom two categories, what percent made it to the top three, middle class plus. So that's why it says C3 to C5, child 3 to child 5, conditional on P1 or P2, parent 1 or parent 2. And what you can see just descriptively is that the student body is far less low income at PWIs than HBCUs, where it's less than 20% at PWIs, and it's about 50% at HBCUs. And there's a lot of variability here, but you can see that there's not that much overlap. But there is more overlap when it comes to the outcome variable, or the y-axis. And so we've highlighted here Florida A&M, which is about 4% of the student body's low income, and about 75% of them make it to at least middle class incomes by the time they're in their early to mid 30s. And at Xavier, a little less than 40% is low income, and almost 80%, 4 in 5 students do so. And so we thought this was important to sort of map the distribution. And then on the next slide, thank you, we talk about this a little bit further. And so here on the left, we have the top 10 HBCUs in elevating their students' income mobility, moving from being low income P1 to child 5, to the top quintile. And so that's sort of the rags to riches, pulling yourself up in one generation from low income to being a higher income household. And the average at HBCUs is 14%. 14% of the students do so. But at, for instance, Howard, 37% of the students that started off low income end up moving from the bottom quintile to the top. And at places like Xavier, it's 31%, Tuskegee, Bennett College, Florida A&M, Dillard, Clark in Atlanta, they're all doing a particularly good job doing that bottom to top leap. But it's not the case we would expect all students to move from the bottom to the top. I mean, not everyone can do that. And so we take a more holistic approach, which is, did you move into what we call at least a middle class status? Do you go into at least the third quintile, where we hope you're set on a good income trajectory and going to have good labor market outcomes in your career, and a stable middle class livelihood. And so from that perspective, the proportion of students that move from the first quintile to at least the third at HBCUs is 66%. That mirrors what I talked about earlier. And there are some HBCUs which are also doing a particularly good job. Xavier, as we saw in the previous slide, 79%, almost 80% or 4 in 5 students are doing that. Other institutions like Elizabeth City State, about 3 in 4 students, Tennessee State, Florida A&M, Prairie View Agricultural and Mechanical. And so these institutions are doing particularly good jobs fostering the mobility for their students. And so my colleague Mary Beth, as she mentioned, she's written extensively, done campus visits and qualitative interviews and case studies about many of the contexts of these institutions to have a better understanding of what they're doing on campus to foster this mobility. Next slide, please. The last thing that I wanted to talk about is privilege perpetuation, or what we also call an affluence floor. And so that's the ability of basically maintaining the status of your parents. If you have relatively well-off parents, and here I'm thinking about growing up in households which had incomes in the 4th or 5th quintile, so the 60th percentile and above, are the students able to maintain that? Are they able to maintain the status of their parents? And we see that this varies very widely depending on, for students that attend HBCUs and PWIs. And so in the table on the left of the slide, almost 44% of students at HBCUs end up in the 4th or 5th quintile, and it's about 57% at predominantly white institutions. Most of this is because at PWIs the students started there, and so that third row, that's the share from 4th or 5th. A third of the students, 34%, 3/4 of the students that end up in the 4th or 5th quintile at HBCUs are because they started there. That means 2/3 of the students who end up in those top two categories moved up into them. Whereas at predominantly white institutions, it's 64%. So most of the students who are ending up in those top categories are because they started there. And what I think is really indicative of this is those bottom two rows where it says the conditional mobility measure. Those are the success rates I've been talking about. If you started in the 4th quintile, did you end up in the 4th or 5th? And the students who attend HBCUs, it's 48%. Did you start in the 5th and end up in the 4th or 5th? Those, it's just under 52%. So I'm going to say that's about 50% of students who started in the 4th or 5th at an HBCU ended up there. At a PWI, it's about 60%. It's a 10 percentage point difference. And so what this means is, if you're a student who attended an HBCU, and these are mostly black students, not entirely, but 86% of these students, you have a 50-50% chance of maintaining the relative affluence of your parents. Whereas the students, and these are mostly, not entirely, but mostly white students who are attending predominantly white institutions, it's 60%. If you translate that into odds ratios, the children of these relatively affluent parents who attended PWIs are 50% more likely to stay affluent than the children of relatively affluent parents who attended HBCUs. And so we don't think this has to do with a specific institution that the students are attending. The student, as we talked about extensively earlier in the presentation, HBCUs and PWIs are doing a pretty good job fostering the mobility of their students, especially HBCUs, given the low income origin of many of their students. What I interpret this to be as when the students exit schooling, they still have to get a job in the labor market, and there's extensive research on wage gaps by gender and by race ethnicity. And so you exit and you still need to deal with the realities of living as a minority in the US. And we can see in our data that there are big discrepancies and there are big issues that still persist. Next slide, please. So to sum up the findings from this report is that being born into a relatively affluent African-American household does not necessarily provide the same sort of safety net as it does being born into a white family. And this is flowing from the evidence of students, predominantly black students attending HBCUs, to predominantly white students attending PWI. Again, they have to, once they exit, they still have to enter the labor market and deal with all sorts of ongoing inequities. More broadly, we see in these HBCU institutions that they're doing a pretty good job fostering the mobility of their students. And so the negative rap that Mary Beth talked about earlier, they don't deserve. They're doing a especially good job considering the share of their students that are coming from low and lower income backgrounds, particularly because their student body is far lower income than the student body at their counterparts at predominantly white institutions. And there are specific schools that are doing a really, really good job of this, and more than you would expect when you average within the groups, including places like Xavier and Tuskegee and Dillard. Next slide, please. You can download our report, and we can make this available after the webinar is over. It's publicly available on the Center for Minority Serving Institutions website at Rutgers. And with that, I'd like to pass it back to my colleague, Mary Beth.
This is Alice, and I'm going to also let you know that this link and a PDF download of the report will be on the SREB website, along with a link to the recording today and the presentation slides. So if you go to sreb.org and then you go to the program Go Alliance, under workshops and webinars, you will find all of that information there.
Great. One thing that I wanted to do before we go to questions is that, can you all hear me? I just want to make sure.
Yes.
Okay. One of the things that oftentimes people will ask is, well, you know, I don't work at an HBCU. What lessons are there for me from this information that we shared on HBCUs or from HBCUs in general? And so one thing I wanted to do is just give you a few takeaways of things that I think that I've learned about HBCUs over time. And I've been to 103 HBCUs over the past 25 years and spent considerable time on campuses. And so I just wanted to share some of these things that I think they piggyback off of the data that Robert shared. And those include one thing that HBCUs do that I've watched is that they spend time gathering information on their students, and they do that in order to bolster student learning. So if they see that students are not necessarily doing a good job, then they'll, many of them will dig into what are the reasons behind that and then share that information with students. And so one of the institutions that Robert talked about in depth is Xavier, and I found that Xavier is particularly good at this, at really taking a look at what's going on with students, and if students are not doing as well in certain classes, taking a look at, well, what's taking place in those classes and why is there some stumbling in that area, and what can we do to alleviate that stumbling. And I think that that's a really wonderful approach to, rather than just assume that it's the student who's at fault for not doing well, to think about, well, what the institution could be doing. Another item that I think is important, and again, this seems really obvious, but the thing that I think makes the HBCU climate different is that the students are engaged in culturally relevant assignments that really speak to the communities from which they come. And you do see some of this at predominantly white institutions, but it's not necessarily the norm. And it's not the norm in high schools, it's not the norm in colleges and universities. And so one of the things we can really learn from HBCUs is that if you can draw people in with culturally relevant curriculum and culturally relevant assignments and hands-on activities, they're much more likely to want to persist. One thing that I think is probably one of the very best aspects of Black colleges is that they encourage collaboration over competition among students in the classroom. And this is something in research that I've done at Spelman, at Morehouse, at Xavier, at Prairie View, A&M. One of the things I've seen across these institutions is that there's an emphasis on making sure that students know that their success is tied to each other and that they should not operate with more of an individualistic attitude, which is pretty much the norm, is to be more individualistic. And so they're encouraging collaboration. And along those lines, another thing that I've seen that has worked particularly well at institutions like North Carolina Central, at Prairie View, I've seen this at Morehouse, I've seen this at Xavier, at Morgan State, is the use of peer-to-peer mentoring among students, especially in STEM, but not completely, so that students are learning from each other, and they're much more apt to ask questions of each other than they might be to ask faculty. And so one of the things I like about HBCUs is that idea that learning can come from a variety of sources. And I think that that also helps, again, with making sure that the student learning experience is really rich. And then the last thing that I wanted to point out is, and I really love this, is that in the research that I've done with a variety of co-authors is that we found that HBCUs really capitalize on student identities and what students bring to the classroom and what they bring to their learning process and their major. And so they capitalize on all those identities and ask them to kind of bring them to the classroom, where, you know, oftentimes what happens at majority institutions, not all, but many of them, is that we ask people to sort of leave who they are at the door. And within HBCUs, the number, you know, the many that I have visited and spent time kind of looking at the work that they're doing, what we have seen is that these identities are embraced. And so that's the last kind of takeaway that I think those are things that any university, any college, actually, quite frankly, I mean, if we, you know, interact with people just in general in these ways, in terms of helping each other, capitalizing on people's identities, asking them to, you know, be upfront about who they are, collaborating over being competitive. I think these really help everybody. So I just wanted to kind of end there before we take questions.
Thank you so much. I think this is incredibly helpful, and I would just agree that many of these things I have seen as well in my work with colleges and universities who are successful at retention rates for low income and first in the family students. So this is fabulous. It's time to go ahead and ask questions. Any questions that you have for our presenters today? If there's something that they said that you want them to elaborate a little bit more on, or maybe you didn't quite understand, or want to ask their opinion about something related, please go ahead and type your question in the question box. So I'm going to give you all a few minutes to do that. And let me know if you cannot find the question box. You can raise your hand, and but it should be pretty easy to find. There is an arrow to the left of it. If you click on it, it will open up the question box. Okay, so while we're waiting on questions, I will ask Mary Beth. One of the things that I found so interesting that you said was to encourage collaboration over competition in the classroom, and that really gets at, you know, from my background in psychology, what we know about, you know, fixed versus malleable or growth mindsets, Carol Dweck's work. But the other thing that's so interesting to me is a lot of the research I've done with students who come from rural backgrounds that are kind of rural, low-income communities. They're also coming from areas in which the culture there highly values collaboration, because in order to survive as a small town, neighbor have to help, you know, they depend on neighbors helping neighbors to kind of weather, you know, the financial storm. And so it's a real cultural value. And I have found that first in the family students often have a hard time thinking individualistically when they get on a higher ed campus, because it's so different from what they're used to in their own culture. And, you know, if you want students to, you know, think independently and voice their own opinion, you know, in a discussion about something they've read, for example, it can be hard. Do you see something similar in your work?
Well, that's a really interesting point. And so here's one thing I would say about that. Within the Black college context, they're not really experiencing that because there's such an emphasis on collaborating. It's not to say that some people aren't going to not want to help their neighbor, right? There are going to always be people like that, but by and large, it's being, you know, faculty, staff, and other students are emphasizing the idea of collaboration. But I think what happens sometimes is, especially when students from HBCUs go on to graduate school at predominantly white institutions, which are not necessarily pushing that kind of ethos of collaboration over competition, that sometimes they're a little bit taken aback by the focus on individualism. And I think that sometimes it can be a little jarring in that people are going to go in making the assumption that they're going to work in teams and that everybody wants them to succeed, and that's not always the case. I mean, I'm going to tell a little story about something that happened when I, prior to my coming to Rutgers, when I was at Penn. I had a student one time who, and this was a white student, who came to me and she said, "Hey, I just want you to know that so-and-so is not reading in your course." And I said, "Okay, thank you," you know, and I said, "Well, have you asked so-and-so why they're not reading?" "Well, no, I just want you to know because I want to get an A, and I just want you to know that this person isn't doing well." And one of the things I said to the student was, "Well, you know, wouldn't it be wonderful if you just found out why the student isn't reading? Maybe they could use some help. Maybe you could help them since you're doing so well." And the person looked at me and said, "I don't understand why I would do that." Right? So I think one of the things that I've found in doing research at HBCUs is that, let's say, for example, at Xavier or at Morehouse in particular, I've done a lot of work in the science area there. I found that students would tell me, the same thing at Norfolk State. Students would tell me, "Oh, if one of our friends isn't doing well or someone in our class isn't doing well and we notice it, we actually pull them aside and we say something." You know, if we're in the same major and we know that person and they're in our class and we're with them all year, we're going to pull them aside and say something. So for me, that's always stuck with me, you know, over the years, is to watch that kind of hand-in-hand support. I wish that was what we, the ethos of all campuses. I wish that we didn't have the zero-sum game. You know, my daughter goes to a women's college, and she experiences the same thing that many Black college students do. Is I always ask her, you know, "Do you ever have any trouble?" And she's like, "Oh no, the women are really, really supportive. They all support me." And I think her experience would be a little bit different if she weren't in that kind of environment. So I think you bring up something really, really important. And I think all of the ethos, the campus ethos, is really at the core of what the research that, you know, the economic mobility research, it's really the reason why you're able to move people is because you offer this kind of experience to people.
Exactly. And we know from Dweck's research how critical that is,
Right.
to have that mindset to learning. Okay, we have a question. Did you study the graduation rate comparing percentage of, let's see, did you study the graduation rate comparing what percentage of students who graduate in 4, 5, or 6 years? Do you understand what they're asking?
So I think so. The graduation rate for students, the 4-year graduation rate, 5-year and 6-year graduation rate. And so that information is available. We weren't looking at that in our particular study because we were looking not at graduation rates as an outcome measure, but rather income and income mobility in particular. And so the income mobility data that we look at, it's about the students, and they may have graduated and they might not have graduated, but it's about the income of the students as compared to their origin when they're in their early to mid 30s. And so Mary Beth talked a little bit about some graduation rates earlier, and some of that is publicly available, but it isn't the focus of our particular report.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. One final question. I think this one is very good. So this person is a practitioner who helps with college and career readiness. She says, how can I leverage this study as a practitioner who works with African American youth?
Well, I'll take a quick stab, and then Robert, please correct me if I'm wrong or jump in. But one thing I would say is I do think that taking out, once you download the report, when you see the key findings, I think, and we had a slide earlier on as well with the key findings, I think one of the things you can do is a lot of times parents will come and say, well, you know, I've heard this about Black colleges, or I've heard this, and I'm a little hesitant. And you can say, hey, but I want to show you. Let's say the student or the parent was from a low-income family. You can say, hey, I want to show you about the possibilities within this context, and you'd be able to use hard data to show that. Robert, does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we're trying to shed light, an empirical, objective light on the some of an important outcome for students who attend post-secondary institutions. And so if someone is in a particular area in the U.S. and they're considering an HBCU or predominantly white institution, they could look at our report and say, oh, HBCUs are doing a pretty good job, and they, especially if they're a low-income household, as Mary Beth talked about, the culture of the HBCU is something that I think is particularly important, and being surrounded by other students who are like you, a more diverse student body. So those are a lot of considerations which some of our work can help add context and flesh out students' understanding as they're deciding which institutions to apply to.
Exactly, and I would add to that the things that Mary Beth talked about, which is why are they doing such a better job, and it's the context and the learning environment that is more supportive for students, but also they feel more comfortable and at home. And you know, it's the environment itself that's really making a difference. So when you're talking to students as to where they want to go and what they want to get out of their college experience, you know, these factors are important in making that decision. The other thing I would add is it's really important for all of us to start a national discussion on how critical these MSI, the minority serving institutions, are because of the funding support that's needed both at the state and federal level for their mission. And the more that we can kind of call attention to the impact that they're having and the great work that they're doing, the more likely it is to call the attention to policymakers who control that funding.
Absolutely. Yep. Agreed.
So I want to thank everyone so much for your time today. Obviously, thank you very, very much, Mary Beth and Robert, for your expertise and this fabulous work. Again, if you didn't hear me say it, the report itself that they were referring to in their presentation today will be made available on the SREB website under Go Alliance. If you go to sreb.org, go to Programs, and then Go Alliance, you will find it there. And we will also post a recording of our session, our time together today, along with their PowerPoints. If you have any other further questions, please feel free to reach out to me and I can get you in touch with our presenters or might be able to help you with some of your questions. And I would say also look out for an email from Go Alliance that will be coming shortly about the next 2 webinars that we're going to have that will round out these series. And these are going to be led by admissions officers and recruiters for historically Black colleges and universities, as well as other MSIs, that will really give you a much better sense of exactly what it's like to be a student on a campus and what their experience is like day to day, both in and out of the classroom. So as you know, this is a very busy admissions season. So getting these people together on a particular day and time has been a challenge, but as soon as we find those dates, I will send out an email and let you know. Thanks so much for your time today, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.